If you're watching us in the United States, we'd like to welcome you to another edition of Votum TV, the Heretics podcast, where we talk with dissidents from the mainstream who have a lot of interesting things to say, especially to the international audience on issues ranging from geopolitics and internal politics. And today we have a very special guest, Darren J. Beattie, editor in chief of the great site, which I highly recommend, and we will put the link in the description box, Revolver News, as well as former speechwriter to President Donald Trump and all around great dissident mind. Darren, how are you doing this morning?
Doing great. Happy to be here and very happy to speak before such an international audience and the Polish people in particular. I think it's very special. So I'm glad to be here.
Indeed. Darren, I want to start off with a quote because in the last few days, one of the great speechwriters in American presidential history, a man you and I both admire, Patrick J. Buchanan, announced that he'll be retiring from active writing, his weekly column. And there was an article, which is a tribute posted on Revolver News. I just want to quote from there, and I'd like you to get your thoughts on sort of the legacy of Pat Buchanan. By making the Republican Party turn against interventionism and forever wars, Donald Trump changed the country for the better. And when he did so, he was channeling one very specific man, Pat Buchanan. From your time in the White House, can you speak to the influence or how big the influence was of the legendary Pitchfork Pat on the trajectory of the White House, President Trump's campaign, and possibly any future run? Well, we know there will be a future run, but any potential future Trump presidency?
Well, that's a great question. And, I think sometimes in these cases, the impact is so large that it's hard to find particular examples because you're just operating within a broader context that was shaped by Buchanan's thought and Buchanan's influence. There was never a time in the White House where people were, that I recall, where people were pointing to. Well, actually, there were there were a couple of important occasions, and I won't name names, when some people would share a Pat Buchanan column with President Trump, but it wasn't as though that was happening all the time, and that wasn't the nature of the influence. The nature of the influence is on a much deeper level, which is that basically the whole kind of program of Trumpism, insofar as it had a kind of ideological component, the substantive aspect of it was really sort of pro-working man, pro-working class, appeals to the silent majority. Trump woke up the silent majority, but in a certain way, like in a very literal sense, Pat Buchanan coined the concept of the silent majority, which is an amazing achievement for a speechwriter when you think about it. For a speechwriter to have coined what's become a household term, a regular feature of our political vernacular, is quite an amazing accomplishment in his own right. And so that's kind of another example of that sort of hidden influence, the influence that's so profound that you don't even know it's there, because many more people have heard of the concept of the silent majority than probably even know Pat Buchanan, let alone know that Pat Buchanan coined that term, right? But I mean, the simplest version is to say that combination of positions, sort of, the way that the Reaganite stuff evolved into sort of hyper financialized, and intellectually degraded free market ideology, combined with sort of aggressive interventionism. Um, that combination, was really something that both Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump attacked head on, and I think that's part of the reason they both got a lot of pushback, and that's sort of the connection. I think that's probably the most salient one. And of course, when we speak of these similarities, that also raises the question of the differences, because I also think there are important differences that perhaps enabled Trump to be, in certain ways, more successful. I mean, in the obvious sense that Trump got to be in the White House as president, and Pat Buchanan, well, he was in the White House for a long time, but in a different capacity as a speechwriter. So there are different things. Sort of the substance at the deepest level, you could say, was inflected with Buchananism, but the style, which to Trump is so important that it becomes a substance unto itself, is quite different with Trump, and that's what enabled him to be uh, the effective spokesperson of that sort of implicit ideology.
Yeah, indeed. I would make the comparison that, in a way, Buchanan was sort of the John the Baptist, if you will, paving the way sort of for the bigger political messiah, in a way, Donald Trump. But a lot of people have made these attributions. Paul Godfrey, a lot of paleo conservatives have spoken in that way, and even Trump. He made some tweets that were. He mentioned actually Pat during his presidency, and obviously Pat Buchanan supported him
And then,
to
of course,
a large
America
degree.
first. America
Yeah,
first, another
exactly.
thing, other than the silent majority, an obvious one is America first.
Something that a lot of people thought went out the window because of its evil
Right.
connotations, apparently.
Well, it's one of those things. It's like, I hate to make this comparison, but it just came to mind, where it's like you'd have Bob Dylan classics like All Along the Watchtower, and then Jimi Hendrix does a cover of it, and then more people associate it with Hendrix, and it's kind of like America first. It's in the sense that Buchanan would have been Bob Dylan in this analogy.
It's a
Um,
very apt comparison, indeed. Yeah, I agree. Um, Darren, I want to get your thoughts on the future of the Republican Party as it stands today in the House. We saw what happened with the choosing of McCarthy. We saw how a few Republicans, the diehards, Matt Gaetz, stood up basically to the very end. We know they got important concessions. We're hoping to see, even here in Poland, where a lot of people know how the inner workings, or we try to see from what the dissident media show, the inner workings of the globalist American empire work, as you aptly coined the term. On the other hand, we're getting news that McCarthy is planning to visit Taiwan. So basically trying to do a Republican version of Pelosi from a few months ago, where we still keep, the pressure on China, and we still try to be this hawkish, Cold Warish, classically Republican in that sense party, but at the same time giving concessions to the sort of America First faction. So in your opinion, what kind of trajectory should we expect in the next few months? Will McCarthy move closer to the Matt Gaetzes of the Republican Party, the J.D. Vances, or do you think he will be more inclined to be a Mitch McConnell type Republican, keeping the orthodoxy, the baseline as it is, and just giving some small concessions to the America First faction?
Well, it's a good question, and it's very difficult to answer with the appropriate level of precision, because there's actually a lot of different things going on there. Just to get into it a little bit. So you mentioned this potential visit to Taiwan and how that might signal, if not a neoconservatism, then certainly a more aggressive participation in this sort of Cold War 2.0 campaign that's largely driven by the military industrial complex. And so the significance of McCarthy sort of gesturing in that direction, which is really not exceptional in American politics. The exceptions are the people who resist it. In this case, it's the easiest thing in politics. Everyone's on board with it, from Pompeo to Biden. Um, people get confused sometimes when I criticize this notion of Beijing Biden, really. And again, it's like, it's hard to disentangle all of it, because he was corrupt and he did do a lot of corrupt deals with China. And so there's this sense that, well, how could you push back against the epithet of Beijing Biden? I think it's a very useful epithet politically in the context of American domestic politics. I wouldn't abandon it insofar as it's effective. Its political truth is something real, but its sort of larger geopolitical truth is more questionable, because you see really a convergence behind the scenes across the elite in support of this Cold War with China. And there are reasons for that that we can explore if you want. But I want to get back to the McCarthy question, because so there's that element of it. There's the element of, well, to what degree did Gates and the other sort of firebrand true America First congressman kind of correct him? Is he have the capacity to be corrected? And if so, how would that manifest? Probably wouldn't manifest itself in terms of foreign policy. It would probably have something to do with the kinds of things that the holdouts were talking about. And the best case, he would be cooperating with these new congressional committees that are designed to investigate national security abuses domestically, these sort of church committee 2.0 things. But it could also impinge upon certain the way that legislation worked, how they slip in these kind of pork into these enormous bills and get away with stuff is something that Gates in particular has been against, like things like the omnibus bill, things like the budget. Those are the things that, insofar as McCarthy will be corrected, I think more relevant to that versus any kind of broad foreign policy thing. And then thirdly, when you ask, well, is he going to become like McConnell? I just want to point out that becoming like McConnell is a very different creature from the grandstanding in Taiwan. So they're different sort of factions and inflections within the broader sort of establishment. If anything, McConnell's accused of being soft on China. He has a wife who has very strong business entanglements in China. He's not necessarily one of these kind of China hawk types. He's one of these swamp types, but he's not, one of these Pompeo types. He's probably easier on China than Joe Biden, frankly, than allegedly, Beijing Biden. So there are all these different flavors here that are ultimately important to disentangle, to address your question with specificity. But I think insofar as McCarthy can be corrected positively, we'll see it in the form of things like, the omnibus bill, like the budget stuff. And then maybe, as I said, the best case, we'll see some cooperation with these congressional committees, that are supposed to investigate the FBI and things like that.
Do you expect any positive moves on Ukraine, which is also an issue to which the Warsaw government is anxiously looking at? Because we know for a fact that if the gravy train stops from Washington, then our capital, our politicians who claim to be conservatives but are acting in full with the neoconservative expectations from some think tank in Washington, they're going to have to rethink their policy also. So, are you expecting? Do you know of any moves that will, at least to some extent, degrade the level of insane support that's going from Washington to Ukraine under McCarthy and the Republicans in the House?
I would be skeptical of that, because again, my sense is that insofar as there's any kind of positive influence on McCarthy, it will manifest in more kind of domestic matters and not foreign policy matters. I don't, even even when you listen to the types of arguments and statements that a lot of the congressional holdouts were making with that big sort of conflict with McCarthy, it wasn't really focused on things like that. And so I doubt it will have a tremendous impact on that, which is not to say that the Ukraine policy is fixed. It's just, if it were to change, the change wouldn't really come from there.
Right. Unless they come across some internal aspects of their investigations, because we know that the Ukrainians did literally interfere in the 2016 elections, and maybe that'll have some bearing on some sort of foreign policy decisions that might come out of the House Republicans. Darren, just going back to your time in the White House, because there's a lot of sort of questions in Poland. A lot of people who are rooting for Donald Trump expected more. A lot of conservatives, a lot of nationalists around the world, and a lot of anti-globalists expected more. Now, we generally understand why some things did not go the way they were supposed to go. Mostly due to obviously internal infighting, the deep state having its deep hands in the White House, which is something that, kind of hard to prepare for because you're going in with a fresh face and you have this sprawling bureaucracy. But from your vantage point, what do you think was, the most crucial element that prevented Trump from applying his most, fundamental policy changes that he advocated in 2016? Was it personnel? Was it process? Was it sabotage? Was it foreign influence? What's your take?
Well, that's a great question, but again, to answer it uh, appropriately, I'd have to have a more specific because I mean there are general factors like yes, personnel generally left much to be desired. There were kind of structural issues with the bureaucracy acting as an impediment to Trump. I mean, just as an example. Um, One of the things that Revolver News has covered extensively is all the January 6th stuff. Well, the sort of uh, the introduction to that, the test run for that, was this Michigan kidnapping plot, which was a pure entrapment operation. But the thing is that the entrapment operation was set up under Trump. Literally, the bureaucracies within the executive branch were responsible for concocting what amounted to the political October surprise that was supposed to sabotage his election prospects. Um, so that's an example of one of many. So there are all these sort of general factors, but once we get into issue by issue, the different things have different weighted importance. So it's like we can talk about the immigration thing and the other things. So I'm not, so to answer it with more specificity, we'd have to get into, well, what specific policy, how, to what extent it wasn't implemented the way that people hoped or anticipated, and then why, because there were, different factors depending on which policy issue we're talking about.
So, for example, because getting along with Russia was a highlight, and in terms of international stability and what we're seeing now in Ukraine, that would have made a change, I believe. So, in this specific area, U.S.-Russian relations, because Trump was fairly sincere when he was saying, we got to reach out to Putin, we got to have this equilibrium in international relations. We have to sort of come back to this Nixonian realist approach and move away from this, saber rattling and neoconish style of politics vis-a-vis Moscow. So, in terms just of U.S.-Russian relations, who do you think was most interested in sabotaging Trump's original agenda from 2016, within or outside his administration?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question because we get to like what was his kind of stated intention, stated agenda. He was saying, I want to get along with Putin. He wasn't never necessarily saying, oh, we should be allies. I think there were some points, and I'm not sure if he said this himself, but definitely people close to him were saying this, is this whole idea that, in the geopolitical chessboard, it doesn't make sense to alienate Russia when our principal um, threat comes from China. And so there was sort of a version of cooperating with Russia, or at least not antagonizing Russia, that was informed by, the push for Cold War with China, frankly. Like, what? Well, why alienate Russia when we can recruit them in our Cold War against China?
Yeah.
That and to the extent that there was sort of strategic argument involved, that was the most common one that I saw. Um, then, of course, people like Bolton said, well, we can, we don't have to pick and choose. We don't have to prioritize. We can go to war with all of them at the same time. We can throw in Iran. We can throw in North Korea. We can throw in Venezuela. We could do it all. So there was that. It wasn't necessarily that he was ever saying, oh, we need to be great allies. He was saying, oh, I want to get along with him. But he said that about said that about Xi, said that about everybody, that he wants to get along, but he wants to be tough and he wants to negotiate things to America's advantage. And that was basically, applied to Putin in the same way it was applied to anybody else. I'd never thought that there was any kind of special
Yeah,
affinity
of
there.
course.
But at the same time, I think rem- a lot of it has to be understood against the context that the principal attack vector against Trump from the regime involved a ridiculous narrative with Russia. And and there are various reasons for that, and it's associated with some of the reporting and analysis I've done about the color revolutions. That it was the same kind of faction within the national security bureaucracy that was so used to um, executing a certain sort of regime change methodology in Eastern Europe. And just as a sociological matter, it was the same people that felt that Trump's populism threatened their power and the United States in the same way that they would think of, say, a Russia friendly quote unquote dictator in Eastern Europe. And so they used the same regime change tools against Trump that they would use against those. And they're the same people. And so part of that is, just the fact that happened to be the same faction. And so they thought, well, we can kill two birds with one stone here and basically attack Trump, but attack him using a narrative about Russia. And, of course, there's the Russia Gate, and anyone who paid any attention to American politics know how dominant that was in the news cycle. And so, unfortunately, like maybe it would have been ideal to simply ignore the thing entirely, not let it affect the way one conducts diplomacy. But the ideal and the actual are different, and there may have been even some kind of overcompensation effect whereby saying, okay, all of these people are saying that we're pro Putin. Well, maybe after the next round of sanctions we do,
Yeah,
they'll understand that it's not, and which of course is not really how it works in terms of appeasing media. But I think there was a certain element of that as well, because a lot of people, like in the State Department and Treasury and things, were very aggressive with sanction policy in a way that maybe wasn't um, totally in line with what the sensible policy would have been, or maybe it wasn't aligned with what the nature of the diplomacy would have been had there not been this narrative. And so it was just the dynamic of it was there's this, you know, concentrated narrative against Trump designed to cripple his presidency at every level. And then you had, some of the handful of, qualified or at least visible national security professionals who were willing to support Trump, but they were also kind of hawkish with Russia. And,
yeah,
Trump is interested in, his maintaining the authority of his presidency more generally. And the Russia thing was an attack broadly on his presidency. So if he has a national security professional who's defending him, but then part of the defense is, well, look at this nonsense from Russia. Well, look at this round of sanctions we did, or pointing out, oh, it was actually Hillary Clinton that was doing
yeah,
business with
yeah.
so Russian oligarch. It's like it's one of those things that, again, it fits into the nature of domestic politics, and part of the reason maybe for a suboptimal outcome is just the nature of the attack against Trump intermingled domestic and foreign policy in a way that was even more intense and counterproductive than before, because they were using a kind of foreign policy national security imprimatur to eliminate a domestic or neutralize a domestic political enemy, because then you can say was a national security threat.
Right.
So I think these are, maybe it's not a full answer to the question, but I think these are some of the dynamics that shaped a lot of what people saw in the kind of foreign policy realm, especially in relation to Russia and Eastern Europe and so forth. Well, and then again, there was like, think about the fracking interest and think about the LNG and all of that, which is tied up with the Nord Stream stuff, which in turn is tied up. So you kind of had this strange situation where, the very kind of faction of the national security apparatus that was most intent on destroying Trump, well, he would kind of like, perhaps unwittingly, or if wittingly, then maybe begrudgingly, or with an understanding that it's still a net positive, kind of ended up really kind of supporting a lot of that agenda, but for different reasons. Because, again, it's like, the gas industry, the stakeholders in American LNG aren't necessarily these Atlantic Council types who think of Trump as a danger, but at the geopolitical level, it sort of cashes out in a very similar place.
Yeah, it's sort of a fallback position in a way that a lot of people try to be MAGA, but they would always be doing this explaining, but we're MAGA, but we're still anti-Russian. We're MAGA, but we're still anti-Chinese, just to appease some of the expectations of these typical Republicans that is our traditional position, but we're still with Trump. But at the same time, so you're in a way you're trying to be into two camps, and I think one of the few, well, maybe two, three, I guess, with you, or maybe four with Peter Navarro, consequential guys who are actually MAGA to the bitter end, sort of, would be, Steve Bannon, Darren J, Beattie, Peter Navarro, and Stephen Miller. At least from my vantage point as a political science PhD student looking into American politics, that's what I saw from my vantage point. So it's interesting that, and I agree with you that it was a sort of you had a background that you always had to, a national security background that was built, during all these years constituting the so-called national security state, that you had to obviously take into consideration when dealing with Russia and China, even in a Trumpian context. So, Darren,
Right.
one last question, because you mentioned that the apparatus was turned against Trump, the sort of color revolution apparatus. And I think Revolver News has done great reporting on the color revolution aspect of all this. And January 6th, which I highly recommend every one of our viewers read the reports of the Revolver News website on January 6th. If you could just try and condense, I know it's not going to be easy, how January 6th more and more basically begins to look like a provocation on the part of the FBI to screw, basically, to use that ugly word, the MAGA crowd, President Trump, and to create this narrative that we can always blame everything on the MAGA crowd, white supremacy, and it was Joe Biden that cleaned it all up. Where does it all stem from? How did it evolve?
Well, yes. I mean, among everything that we've covered, probably we've had the greatest impact on shaping the national narrative pertaining to January 6th, which American politicians, at a bipartisan level, but mostly the Democrats, there are some Republicans as well, like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and so forth. But they've compared January 6th, they call it an insurrection. They compare it to 9/11. In fact, I think Joe Biden said that that's not doing full justice to January 6th, and we need to go back to the Civil War to find a kind of an appropriate comparison. So they're really hyping up the significance of it. And again, the reason they're doing that is they're using the narrative of this insurrection to further facilitate the weaponization of the national security state domestically against the American people, and especially American people who are adjacent to Trump, who sympathize with Trump, who don't like the direction that the Biden regime is taking the country in, and all it's a broad range of people that encompasses at least half of the American population that's cast as de facto domestic terrorists, which is very dangerous development in our politics. That's why it's important to get to the bottom of what really going on with January 6th. So in a nutshell, the Revolver News thesis is that it wasn't an insurrection. It's what I call a Fedsurrection. And what I mean by that is that, of course, not everybody in the crowd was, a card-carrying member of the FBI. Of course not. What I mean is, and we document this extensively with video footage, and the whole range of things that people can find. If you go to revolver.news, at the sides of the website, there are two columns. Each has the January 6th series. And if you just read one piece, you go scroll down to Meet Ray Epps, part 1 and part 2, because this is where all the video is. And what the video shows is that had it not been for a handful of really critical participants on that day, who are overwhelmingly likely to be associated with the federal government, or at the very least were not acting authentically on that day. Had it not been for this handful of individuals, none of whom are arrested or charged, and some of whom haven't even been identified, had it not been for them, this rally would not have turned into a riot. These people each had a specific role in creating the preconditions necessary for having January 6th unfold the way that it did. And so it goes beyond what's also provable, which is that all of the militia groups imputed to January 6th were so heavily infiltrated that whatever they were planning in advance, the government knew in advance. So it would be one thing to say, oh, they knew in advance and they didn't stop it. That would be a scandal in its own right. But what we show goes a step further and gets even darker. And that is that not only did they know in advance, but they played an active role in creating the preconditions that allowed this to happen. So that's sort of the bird's eye view of it. And for the particulars and for the details, people just have to go to revolver.news. And it's a real education in, the nature of our government. And I think, people in Europe, especially Central and Eastern Europe, have a more kind of, actually, I sometimes say healthy cynicism, but I think the cynicism, maybe not in Poland, but definitely in Eastern Europe, can even go a little bit too far and be counterproductive. I think there's like a happy medium. Like Americans are incredibly naive and like Eastern Europeans are incredibly cynical. And I think neither one is really a healthy way to experience reality. But, a lot of Americans, when they see these videos, January 6th, they say, oh my God, I wish I never saw that because I can't think of the country in the same way. That's how scandalous it is. And that's how explosive it is. And that's why our reporting generated such an emphatic reaction across the board, but particularly from the mainstream media. And it was, I don't know if you remember, but when we first started reporting on this, it was a scandal on the level that we hadn't seen since Trump was doing it. I mean, They really freaked out because, before our reporting, people were just talking about it in terms, I know deep down in my bones there was something off, but they couldn't really articulate it. And it usually would come out in the form of, oh, they were leftists, oh, they were Democrats, oh, they were Antifa. And the regime was fine with that. But then once we kind of redirected the narrative, saying, no, it's actually the feds, that's a very uncomfortable place to be. And so, but it's necessary to understand the nature of the government and where we are now. And hopefully, I really hope that that's part of the agenda and these new committees that I alluded to earlier in Congress. And I hope that Kevin McCarthy can be persuaded to be cooperative in relation to these committees, so we can work to get to the bottom of the dirty and dark story of January 6th.
Well, as Ronald Reagan once said, through Revolver News, I hope you make him feel the heat, and I hope he gets the message. Darren, thank you for your time. I know you got to run. I hope the insight that you provided today will open a lot of eyes. Definitely, everyone listening, check out Revolver News. We'll put the links to Darren's Twitter and the website in our description box. In the meantime, Darren, keep on fighting. God bless you, and I hope to see you soon on our program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Take care.